Congressman Kilmer, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm excited to talk with you because I think the work that you're doing in Washington, D.C. is so interesting, especially when it relates to small towns and rural communities. Can you talk just a little bit about why you are so focused on fighting for small towns and rural communities?
Well, I grew up in one. I grew up in Port Angeles on the Olympic Peninsula. I was in high school right around the time the timber industry took it on the chin. Saw a lot of my friends' parents lose their jobs, saw some of my neighbors lose their jobs, and that had a big impact on me. I went off to college. Literally, my senior thesis in college was how do you help timber towns in Washington state? Did the same thing in graduate school. I looked at mining towns in the UK and logging towns in Washington, basically trying to get my head around this question of how do you create more economic opportunity for more people in more places so that no matter what zip code you live in, you've got a shot. We have seen massive disruptive economic change, and too often our public policy doesn't empower people to navigate that change rather than to be victimized by it. And so worked in economic development professionally, got grumpy, kept finding myself saying, gosh, what government does and doesn't do sure impacts our ability to grow jobs. And finally, some of my friends said, you seem to have a lot of good ideas and you sure complain a lot. Why don't you go do something about it, pal? And I'm also conscious of the fact that my region's not unique. We know that about 30% of the U.S. population lives in economically distressed communities. And I think shame on all of us if we fail to develop public policy in a way that creates economic growth, that creates opportunity in those spaces.
So I think you have an excellent perspective because you grew up in a small town, but you also have the academic understanding of economic development, and you're also in a position of power to do something about that. For those that don't for those that don't come with that context, who economic development might be a new thing. Can you talk a little bit about how policies we pass in Washington D.C. impact local economies?
Yeah, in so many ways. I mean, if you think about everything from tax policy, where incentives are created for something for businesses to make location decisions. Certainly Farm Bill, which is coming up upon us, that provides support to farmers through things like crop insurance and ag research and conservation programs that can provide on the positive side a boost to rural economies. Sometimes, if we're not thoughtful about it, trade policies can be very disruptive in terms of negatively impacting rural communities. If we're not adequately thinking about how we're creating American jobs, uh, exporting American products, I think that can be very disruptive. You've seen recently, with the passage of the infrastructure law, investments like broadband access. I think there's a growing understanding that access to the internet today is almost like rural electrification was in past decades. You just need it. And the reality is, we learned over the course of the pandemic that access to the internet is not just about whether you can watch season 3 of The Mandalorian on Disney Plus, which you should because it's awesome. But it's about, whether you can have a telehealth appointment or whether you can take an online class or whether you can operate your business remotely. I visited 2 city councils. I visited all the city councils in my district over the pandemic. There were 2 where we had an online city council meeting where the city council members couldn't turn their video on because there wasn't adequate bandwidth in their communities. And so we know that when we're making these investments in things like broadband access, those are the types of smart investments that can make sure that communities aren't being left behind.
And I know that is, a lot of that was the inspiration for the bill that you worked on, the RECOMPETE program that you got passed through the CHIPS bill.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that bill specifically and how that bill will benefit small towns and rural communities?
Yeah, the RECOMPETE bill and the pilot that was established in the CHIPS and Science Act was really a recognition of 3 problems. One, the reality is distressed communities, rural communities, by and large, just do not have a army of grant writers to navigate a complex system of federal grants and loans. 1. 2, while a one-off grant can be helpful, the reality is most of these communities didn't fall into a state of struggle in 1 year, and frankly, they're not going to get out of it in 1 year. And 3, different communities have different needs. If you're in Aberdeen, one of the biggest challenges is flooding. 90% of the land base is in the floodplain. If you're up in Forks, it's internet access. Some communities have challenges with regard to workforce development. Some have brownfields that need to get cleaned up. My brother worked in a mill in Port Angeles that closed in the late 90s and continues to be a derelict site sitting behind a chain link fence. And so the reality is different communities have different needs. So how did the Recompete Act seek to address that? Well, one, it said, let's provide some assistance through the Economic Development Administration to actually provide some technical assistance to communities to develop a strategic plan for closing that employment gap. The sort of measure of success in that bill is prime age employment, so that people who are of working age are employed rather than unemployed. So, step one is a whole lot of technical assistance from the EDA working with distressed communities on developing a strategic plan and having a relatively simple process for pursuing assistance. Again, just acknowledging that communities don't have an army of grant writers. Two, rather than having a one-off grant, the Recompete Act suggests long-term support, 5 years of financial assistance from the Economic Development Administration with an eye toward closing that prime age employment gap. And three, the money's flexible. Some communities may use it to provide small business assistance. Some may use it around workforce development. Some may use it for infrastructure investment. Some may use it for other needs, all with an eye towards helping struggling communities create more economic opportunity so that no matter where you live, you got a shot. And, thankfully the bill was bipartisan. The effort to get it in the CHIPS and Science Act was bipartisan. We were able to secure a couple $100 million in the omnibus spending bill, which was bipartisan. And now the push is to make sure we continue to fund this program. We need to make sure that we're providing funding on an annual basis. The pilot's been authorized for 5 years. I think it's really important for Congress to step up, fund it at the maximum level every year so that we can help as many communities have as many pilots as possible and really do a proof point to show that when we do place-based economic development, we can really create economic opportunity and we can make a difference for these communities.
And talk a little bit about what you hope to learn from these pilots. Like, how will you know if this program is a success?
Yeah, well, so the goal, as I mentioned, is to lower the prime age employment gap, which is the number of working age adults between age 25 and 54 who are not in the workforce at all. And, as a pilot, Recompete is really designed to test different approaches to lower that gap between persistently distressed areas with high numbers of folks that are out of the workforce and more prosperous areas. So we want to learn which strategies are most effective in promoting economic growth and promoting job creation. We also want to see, the reality is, my hope is the Economic Development Administration, uh, you know, makes investments across a wide variety of rural communities. You know, I represent a bunch of timber towns. There's also mining communities. There's Rust Belt communities that had manufacturing operations that have gone away. And my hope is that we sort of demonstrate the theory of the case that when we do place-based economic development, it can make a real difference.
Excellent. And, I think a lot of us in small towns and rural communities are really excited about this program. And we're really interested to, build momentum on these types of place-based policies as we head into things like the Farm Bill and into the future. Can you talk a little bit about how we can be helpful to pass more programs like this?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, the reality is, one is the thing I just mentioned, which is we need to make sure now that this program is authorized that it's funded. There's concern about that this year. The new House majority has said it's going to mark up bills at fiscal year 2022 levels. This program didn't exist in 2022. And so there's a real peril that rather than providing the maximum amount of funding that's authorized, that, maybe they provide nothing. Maybe they provide just some small fraction of it. And I think that would be a real setback, unfortunately. So that's a piece of this. Honestly, I think it's important that the folks who are participating in this event, actually just staying engaged on issues that affect rural communities, on legislation to address some of the challenges that rural communities face, engaging with your elected representatives to express support for things like the Recompete Act. That is. Elected officials, representative is not just my title, it's my job description. And so when I hear from my constituents who say, hey, this is really important, I would guess, candidly, Matt, that the majority of members of Congress haven't heard of the Recompete Act. And so making sure that people know about it, that elected officials are hearing about it, that they're advocating for it in the appropriations process, I think is really important if we're going to help ensure that rural communities receive the support that they need to flourish.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for all that you're doing for small towns and rural communities across the country.
You bet. Thanks for your partnership, Matt. Appreciate it.